Hello, everyone. Warmest welcomes to Holy Comforter Episcopal Church. I'm Jimmy Abbott, the priest here at Holy Comforter, and our adult Christian formation series for fall 2020 is Liturgy, the Work of the People. Today is episode 4, week 4 of our series called Liturgy, the Work of the People. And what we're doing is during this time of pandemic and social distance, a time in which we are away from the normal routines of church, we're taking a step back. We're taking stock of why it is we do what we do. Indeed, that is the question that is guiding our time. It's this question from the book Liturgy for Living. The question is, of course, why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? Now, I think we should acknowledge that during this time of pandemic and social distance, a lot has changed. We've all tried new things, new ways to connect with each other and with God. And that is going to be the theme for this week, is trying new things. Now, there's a story that I want to share with you. It was a story told to us by the Reverend Dr. Bob Pritchard, who wrote A History of the Episcopal Church. He was the church historian at Virginia Seminary for a long time. And for a time, he served as a parish priest in Virginia. He had this great story that it was 1979. The new prayer book had just come out. That's the prayer book we all now know. It's not really new to me. It's actually older than I am, but whatever. The new prayer book had come out. And Bob, the priest, Bob Pritchard, said, it's time to put away the old 1928 prayer books. And you can imagine trying new things is hard, change is hard. So the parishioners clamored. They said, well, okay, we'll use the new 79 prayer book, but we won't get rid of the old 1928 prayer books. And he said, fine. So he packed them all up in a box. He climbed up into the bell tower of the church and put this box of 1928 prayer books up there. And what did he find was the box of prayer books from 1892. So obviously when the 28 prayer books had come out, the priest back then had packed up all the 1892 prayer books, put them in the attic, because you can imagine the people saying, oh, don't get rid of the old prayer books. We as Episcopalians really love our traditions. We pride ourselves on that. And I think that is a good thing. But during this time, as I said, of social distance and pandemic and trying new things, I want us to think about what some of those new things are. This always brings up all of these questions of why. Why do we think we need to change things? Why is what we're doing not working anymore? Why do we think that the new thing will be better? So let's just take a little bit of a walk down memory lane. Let's think about the prayer books from the Church of England. Of course, the first being 1549 during the English Reformation. There was another revision in 1552, yet another revision in 1559, and then the still authorized prayer book in the Church of England is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. I think this is just an interesting thing that we could say right here. We oftentimes talk about wanting to hold on to the tradition, to go back deeper into the tradition. Well, which one, right? Because each of these prayer books did represent a little bit different flavor of the Church of England during all of these revisions. In the Episcopal Church, we also have had 4 prayer books. We had the 1789 Book of Common Prayer, which is mostly based off the 1662 Book of Common Prayer from the Church of England, though there is heavy influence from the Scottish Episcopal Church. Just a little side note to history, of course, Samuel Seabury consecrated at the Episcopal Cathedral Church in Aberdeen, Scotland, and so there's always this, the Scottish influence in the American Episcopal Church, which is largely true. 1892, there is a revision to the Book of Common Prayer. In 1928, there is another revision. Then, of course, as I said, the 1979 prayer book, our current prayer book. Now, to get there, I think I talked about it a few weeks ago. There were 2 trial liturgy books that came out. creatively called the Green Book and the Zebra Book. And they had all the different services in here. And what the intention was that parishioners and congregations would use these and then submit their feedback to the Episcopal Church, so that when the new prayer book actually was proposed in 1976, they felt like they had a lot of input from the church. And then, of course, it was completely ratified in 1979. Now, one of the interesting things I think is we can go back to this chart this diagram that we used last time to talk about the concept of liturgical time. And I think we can use this also to talk about prayer book revision and trying new things in the Episcopal Church. See, even though we're moving ahead, even though there's always forward movement, oftentimes we're circling back around and doing something that's old again. You could actually say that the 1979 Book of Common Prayer represents a more ancient form of liturgical Christianity by its insistence on Sunday Eucharist and by public baptism, especially those two things. Those were things that had not been widespread in Anglicanism until 1979 prayer book, but they had been the mainstays of much of the early church. So we see again this, even though we're moving forward, we're going back around upon ourselves and trying something old as the new thing. Now, there are some things that we think are old that are in the 1979 prayer book, but are actually new. Take the imposition of ashes. The imposition of ashes was not really a thing in Anglican prayer books and Episcopal Church prayer books. We kind of think it's an old thing. We think it's an old tradition, but it's really not. Even if you go right now and look in your 1979 Book of Common Prayer about Ash Wednesday, it even says if ashes are to be imposed. So there's not even this presupposition that ashes will be used on Ash Wednesday, which I think is also interesting, that here we are trying a new thing, thinking that it's an old thing, but actually it is a new thing. Here's another one of the curiosities of the Episcopal Church in our history, which I think is just illuminating for my point here, that trying new things oftentimes looks like old things. In some of our recent debates about same-sex marriage and what that liturgy would look like, what the form of that worship service would be like, there was actually a movement in the Episcopal Church to have the same-sex marriage service be the wedding service from the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, with just the pronouns used appropriately and changed appropriately. Now, if that doesn't sort of blow your mind a little bit, here we are doing a new thing, which would be same-sex marriage, but using the old prayer book service. I think that is partially an icon, this image of who we are as Episcopalians. We want to try new things, and we think that's good. However, we're always going to tap into our tradition to understand the best way forward. So now we come to a time of pandemic and social distance. You can see there's me leading morning prayer online there in the chapel. We have a much better system for doing it now technologically. I don't stack things on top of other things. You can see there's my prayer book at home and my computer from which I lead a lot of our worship services. And then, of course, an empty church. So in this new time, how can we faithfully experiment without detaching ourselves from the tradition? Because remember, in this concept, there's never a complete separation from the tradition. There's always some sort of continuity with the past. So how do we retain that continuity even in this time of difference, social distance, pandemic, and of trying new things? The biggest question, of course, is around Holy Communion. Why this and not that? Why, at least at Holy Comforter, are we continuing using morning prayer and now evening prayer for our outdoor services and not Holy Communion. Now, there have been all sorts of different ways that people have thought about doing Holy Communion and are doing Holy Communion, from drive-through services to all manner of things. Now, personally, for me, I don't feel that I am ready to start experimenting with Holy Communion. However, I feel perfectly comfortable with other clergy and other parishes experimenting with how to do Holy Communion during a time of pandemic. One of those big changes, is doing Holy Communion in one kind only for the lay people. That would be that the lay people would just receive the bread, whereas the celebrant would receive the bread and the wine. Now, interestingly, that also looks a little bit like our past, because in the medieval church, it would be that the clerics only would receive both kinds and the lay people would receive one kind. But of course, during the Reformation, that all was changed, and the insistence was that everybody ought to be invited to receive both kinds. So you can see here, my understanding and the tradition that I am claiming says that lay people ought to receive both kinds, coming from the tradition of the English Reformers and from the New Testament in the early church. While at the same time, there are folks who we would say are trying a new thing with Holy Communion in one kind, which actually looks a lot like the medieval church. Again, two traditions vying for the same place in our church. So why am I not comfortable right now experimenting with Holy Communion? Maybe this is a personal thing for me. Maybe I feel that we at Holy Comforter have experimented and tried new things around Ash Wednesday, especially drive-through ashes. And I feel like almost we have done our part. We have thought deeply about Ash Wednesday, about what it means, about what that sign means, about what it means to confess our sins, what it means to call a community to confession and to prayer and to worship. And maybe I'm just not ready to be on the front edge of this new thing, but rather to allow other parishes and other clergy to try it out. And I could sort of toot my own horn about that, but I do want to say that I feel like there are probably other clergy people and other parishes who are more suited to think creatively about communion than at least I am and we are right now. And I think that's part of where I am to do why this and why not that, is I want to hear more from my peers and my colleagues and from other parishes about the ways that they've done communion and how that has influenced and shaped them, and then maybe follow in their footsteps as other churches have followed in our footsteps on Ash Wednesday, which I think is great. Because remember, in the kingdom of God, there is no such thing as competition. There is only cooperation. So my journal question for you is this: why do you accept some traditions and not others? Why do you accept some traditions and not others? So think about all those traditions, maybe family traditions, church traditions. What are some that you accept and what are some that you reject, and why? Why is that? So again, thank you for joining me. Again, as I said, we're taking a little bit of a step back, more of a philosophical look, a theological look at liturgy, the work of the people, not necessarily about the how and the what and the where and the when, but the why, some of those deeper questions. I'd love to hear from you about some of your traditions, some of the traditions in the Episcopal Church that you accept, some that you have problems with. Maybe you and your parish or your clergy have been experimenting with Holy Communion, trying a new thing in this time. I want to hear from you. I want to learn what you are doing and allow you to be the pathfinder for us. And I would love to share with you what we have done around Ash Wednesday, and that we can maybe share some of that with you and be the pathfinder for you. Always remembering that we are coming back to a tradition that we have received in order to try something new in continuity. Again, I'm Jimmy Abbott. Thank you so much for joining me. Would love to hear from you. God bless you and the work that you do.